Have you ever felt the desire to look through a peephole just because? Not because you thought someone was knocking, not because you heard noises behind the door, but just out of curiosity, to see if something is happening in the hallway. You walk through the hallway, pass by the door, and you feel like peeking through the peephole just because. Does this feeling sound familiar to you? Can you remember doing this at least once? I wouldn't advise it. I had such a habit, and I paid for it, though perhaps I couldn't help it. It was a compulsive action, a ritual, a compulsive behavior. I walked from the room to the kitchen, looked through the peephole, walked from the kitchen to the room, looked through the peephole, went to the bathroom, had to look through the peephole, walked back, had to look again. I never thought about what this symptom might signify, or even that it could be a symptom at all, because it's such a small thing. Everyone has signs of ill health. We all live in an imperfect world, full of stress and anxious events. Looking through the peephole was unnecessary for me. I live on the top floor, so no one passes through it. There are no neighbors on the landing. Opposite me is just one empty, unfinished apartment that no one seems to be planning to move into. And our hallway is quiet. I had no reason to constantly look to see what was happening there. The view of the empty landing calmed me, relieved the itch in my head, until one day I saw a guest behind the door. It happened in the evening. I habitually lifted the lid, leaned my chest against the door, looked, and there stood a little man. Although not a man, it was an ugly creature of short stature. I jumped back from the door, rubbed my eyes, and looked again. It wasn't my imagination. There stood the dwarf. He had raspberry-colored skin, yellow eyes, one lower than the other. His mouth was fish-like, the upper jaw noticeably larger than the lower one, and the mouth slit pointed downwards. The dwarf was barrel-chested. His clothes were worn and tattered. He stood in front of my door as if waiting for it to open. I immediately realized I was seeing something otherworldly, completely unrelated to our world. I felt it wasn't wise to reveal myself and, trying not to make noise, retreated into the room. No one knocked on my door. It was quiet in the hallway, but I knew he was still there. Not human. A creature. I often suffered from a sense of oppressive loneliness. I lived alone. No one came to visit me, not even the last New Year's I celebrated in my own company. I thought, if only someone would visit me, but I wasn't happy to see such a guest. He scared me. I pondered the creature many times and concluded, at times when nothing is heard in the hallway, when you don't expect to see anyone there, someone from another reality may be outside your door. Not everything in the world can be explained. Why he stands there is unknown. However, seeing such guests is probably impossible. There can be consequences from meeting the otherworldly. That's why they behave so quietly, manifest when no one is watching, but still want to be accidentally noticed. I accidentally had such an opportunity because of my habit. I decided that I would no longer look through the peephole unnecessarily. I actually did it less now, but didn't stop completely. Sometimes I forgot and leaned to the peephole when I walked through the hallway, only to remember later that I shouldn't. After all, I haven't seen any dwarf behind the door anymore, so my compulsion again didn't seem dangerous to me. I wasn't tense when I looked through the peephole because I expected to see only the convex and rounded image of an empty landing, rails, a meter box door, and the ceiling. I even felt a shadow of disappointment because I saw nothing. The possibility of seeing someone from another world gave meaning to my ritual. What if he will be there again? And one day, when I least expected it, I saw that ugly creature again. I saw it and recoiled, terrified to the core, but intrigued. It seemed to me that this was a rare and valuable opportunity. I remembered that the peephole is a special optical device designed to look through the door without revealing your presence inside the apartment. Whoever is outside cannot know whether the peephole is open or closed, whether someone is looking at it or not. The main thing is not to make noise, and you can examine the dwarf as much as you like. I leaned into the peephole again. The dwarf was still there. I observed him and noticed new features of his appearance. He had pointed ears, and in his mouth, there were countless teeth. They were like tiny needles, not human. I watched the dwarf with great interest, almost stopped being afraid, and suddenly, He looked straight at me and said in a hoarse voice, "If you keep looking, I'll gouge your eye out." Those words hit me like a hammer. I closed the peephole cover, rushed into the room, turned on the TV. I wanted to drown my fear in noise. There was a stand-up show for below-average minds, but I laughed at jokes that on another day I would have found insultingly dull. It was hysteria. The dwarf scared me with his threat. I no longer wanted to see anything like that. I hoped that the idea that the peephole is a source of danger had firmly settled in my brain. Better to stick to fingers in a socket than to look there again in my life. I held out for a whole month. The peephole cover was now taped with Scotch tape, but I didn't even feel the urge to look there. One day I heard voices in the hallway. I listened, obviously. They were people. They were talking about cable and a box. I cracked the door open and saw two installers from the local internet provider. They explained that they needed to get to the attic. I apologized for my curiosity. For the next hour, I heard conversations behind the door, the attic hatch opening and closing. Then the noise subsided. I was just curious whether they had finished their work or not, but I didn't want to open the door again and show myself to them. So I peeled off the tape from the cover and looked through the peephole. No one. Nothing to be afraid of. What happened was a long time ago. Anyway, in my house, I'm the master. I look through the peephole if I want to. I don't if I don't. It's my business. I thought and crumpled the piece of sticky tape in my fist. The same week, I looked through the peephole just because, and immediately noticed it. It seemed to me that I was returning to my ritual. Couldn't I do without it? I couldn't. I suppressed the urge to lean my eye against the lens for so long that they became stronger than before. The compulsive urge pulled me every time I found myself in the hallway. If I resisted it, I felt anxiety, which intensified and intensified. I sat and thought that I had passed by and didn't look through the peephole. It seemed to me that I should have done it. Some people constantly check electrical appliances and the gas stove. They need to make sure 10 times that they are turned off. And I needed to know that everything was okay in the hallway. And I resumed this habit. I couldn't do anything about it. I was afraid to do it and felt anxious if I didn't. A vicious circle. Sometime I had to catch a terrible guest in the stairwell. It was a matter of time. And I caught him. Only this time it wasn't an ugly dwarf. Behind my door stood a living shadow. A black silhouette of a person, but with visible eyes and teeth. The whites of the eyes and a smile like an animal's snarl stood out in solid blackness. When I looked through the peephole, the shadow man suddenly moved towards me. I forgot that the door separated me and this creature. It seemed to me that it would grab me now. I jumped back and hit my head against the wall. Behind the door came a shrill laughter. The shadow man enjoyed my fear. How was I to live with this now? The worse my nerves got, the more I wanted to look through the peephole. I tried not to spend evenings at home, but as soon as I returned, I immediately resumed my old habits. I taped the peephole cover with sticky tape and tore it off the same day. It was like sitting with a clothespin on my nose. When there is no possibility to see the landing at any moment, it's hard to breathe. I read many articles about compulsive rituals. Now I understood that I did it to calm my thoughts. Weeks of training and I barely learned to control it. Everything was fine until I looked through the peephole again. This time, the otherworldly creature forced me to do it. In my hallway under the door appeared a murky brown puddle. I brought a bucket and a rag. This puddle smelled of blood. I cleaned the floor, but half an hour later, it leaked again from under the door. What's going on there? I looked through the peephole. It wasn't a dwarf or a shadow man. A new guest, or guestess. Her face was hidden by a horrible papier-mâché cat mask. It had wide slits for eyes and mouth.